Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for coming. And welcome to How It's Made, the RITM book edition, an event in which we'll celebrate and hear from 3 Yale faculty members who have authored important books in recent months. I'm Stephen Pitty, Director of Yale's Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, and Professor of History, American Studies, and Ethnicity, Race, and Migration. I'm going to be moderating today's conversation, which should run a little longer than an hour. Since its founding in 2016, the RITM Center has worked to support publications by students and faculty and to organize events of interest on the Yale campus in other academic settings and for wider groups of people who aren't affiliated with a college or a university. So I hope that you'll keep your eyes open for news of other events and opportunities through RITM in the days and weeks to come. If you aren't already receiving our weekly newsletter, please sign up for it today. The link will be posted soon in the chat. I'm going to introduce briefly our 3 speakers in the order in which they'll be discussing their books today. Each of them will talk for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So if you have a question for one or more of our authors, please post it in the Q&A. We are very eager to hear from you, and I know that our authors would love to respond to any questions that you have. Our first speaker today is Laura Barraclough, the Sarai Ribicoff Associate Professor of American Studies at Yale. Laura is an interdisciplinary scholar of land, memory, identity, and inequality in the United States. She's the author of Making the San Fernando Valley, Rural Landscapes, Urban Development, and White Privilege. And she's co-author with Laura Pulido and Wendy Chang of A People's Guide to Los Angeles. She will be speaking today about her new book, Charros, How Mexican Cowboys Are Remapping Race and American Identity, published by the University of California Press. Daniel Martinez HoSang is an associate professor of ethnicity, race, and migration and American studies with a secondary appointment in the Department of Political Science at Yale University. Dan's work explores US political culture in many sites, including electoral politics, social movements, and cultural formations. He is the author of Racial Propositions, Ballot Initiatives in the Making of Post-War California, and the co-editor of 3 books, including one entitled Seeing Race Again, Countering Color Blindness Across the Disciplines. Dan will be speaking today about his recent book, Producers, Parasites, Patriots, Race and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity, which he co-authored with Joseph Lowndes and which was published by the University of Minnesota Press. Our third speaker today is Ana Ramos-Zayas, a professor of ethnicity, race, and migration and of American Studies and Anthropology at Yale University. Ana is the author of National Performances, Class, Race, and Space in Puerto Rican Chicago, and of Street Therapists, Affect, Race, and Neoliberal Personhood in Latino Newark. She is also co-author of Latino Crossings, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and the Politics of Race and Citizenship, and she has 2 co-edited books that are forthcoming, Diálogos Críticos in Latina Studies, and Whiteness in Latin America and the Caribbean. Ana will be speaking today about her recent book entitled Parenting Empires, Class, Whiteness, and the Moral Economy of Privilege in Latin America, which was recently published by Duke University Press. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Laura and just ask Laura to talk a little bit about the making of her book, Charros, How Mexican Cowboys Are Remapping Race and American Identity. Laura.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thanks to my colleagues, Dan and Ana, for being here. This idea has been a long time in the making, and given COVID, given the state of the world, it took us a while to be together, but I'm so happy to be here and to be in celebration, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to try to share my slides here. One moment, please. Okay, so I'm speaking today, as Steve mentioned, from my new book, Charros, How Mexican Cowboys Are Remapping Race and American Identity. And in a general sense, the book is really tracking the various ways in which Mexican immigrant and Mexican American communities in the United States have mobilized this extremely significant figure of the charro in pursuit of various political, social, and cultural initiatives in the United States. And so I just want to briefly explain what a charro is, or who a charro is. He is most probably most familiar to folks because the charro suit, or the traje de charro, is worn by mariachi musicians. But the charro that I am writing about in the book is related more to the acts of horseback riding, and ranching and roping and rodeo. So the best translation of the word charro might be Mexican horseman. And just an aside, that as the publisher and I were deciding on the title for the book, in the subtitle is Mexican cowboys. And I think that's a partial translation, but it's not a great translation, because at least in the US, the image we have of a cowboy is of a kind of a working class, isolated, rough figure. And in Mexico, the figure of the charro is much more associated with the elite, with landowners, and with, most of all, probably most significantly, with highly skilled, dignified work on horses with other ranch owners. So it's much more of an elite or a gentleman. The gentleman horseman might be a better translation. And charros have a long history in Mexico, 400 plus years. It's a figure that's associated with Spanish colonization. And he really has contested, divergent meanings. So on the one hand, he has been associated with the elite in Mexico, the Spanish colonial elite, but he also has been associated with nationalist revolutionary figures like Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa. And so part of what I was interested in are those struggles over what the charro should mean in terms of its class status and his relationship to Mexican nationalism. But the particular contribution of my book was to try to track the ways that those debates had been carried out in the United States. So the charro is very, very well studied within Mexico. There's great critical scholarship by Mexican scholars, a lot of which I cite in the book, but he had not been the study of significant scholarship in the US. And this is despite the fact that charros have emerged as political actors in the United States as early as the 1930s. We did have a couple of good ethnographies by anthropologists that had been conducted in the 1990s, but there was really no history of the ways that charros had been used by Mexican American communities. And so that was the purpose of my book, how Mexican communities in the US have mobilized this complicated and yet very significant figure for a variety of social and political change initiatives. Importantly, my book was not an ethnography. It is an analysis that is very much public facing. I was focused on how ethnic Mexican communities have tried to impact various public institutions and social structures, and to link that to the long history of dispossession and racialization in the United States. And sometimes that involved looking at how charro communities in the US had challenged whitewashed mythologies of ranching and rodeo and cowboys in the Americas. And so that is where the idea of the subtitle, how these cowboys, again, an inadequate term, have remapped American identity, in part by invoking this longer and hemispheric history of the charro in the US. So I used a variety of sources, Spanish and English language newspapers, lots of archival collections deposited in various US institutions, mostly in the Southwest, by middle-class Mexican-American figures who were involved with charro associations, or associations of men who ride and rope together and compete together. A few interviews looking at legislative documents, school curricula, all kinds of things. It's a very interdisciplinary study. And a lot of this was about place, which we'll talk a little bit about later on in our conversation. And so I just want to show you some of the specific case studies that the book is looking at. I start in Los Angeles, where the focus was really on the ways that the charro became a vehicle for Mexican Americans to integrate the state, and specifically the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. This is Sheriff Eugene Vizcailuz, who could trace his identity back to elite California families, and who dressed up as a charro as the head of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. There was also a group of working class Mexican Americans from East LA who joined the sheriff's posse in this period. And this is in the 1940s and 1950s. And I think this is a really important counterpart to other studies of Mexican Americans in LA in the wartime era, who were mostly persecuted by the police. But in this case, charros were also members of the police. And you can see that here, these are LA Sheriff's Department posse charros in the background of this photo. I also have a study of San Antonio in the 1940s and 50s, where the charros were much more focused on the economy. So these were folks who were part of the city's tiny, tiny middle class, Mexican-American middle class, but who were uniquely positioned to draw on the image and the history of the charro to build a binational tourist economy, drawing in investors from northern Mexico at a time when San Antonio was really trying to propel its own urban growth. And so that gave them a degree of economic leverage. I also have some materials on Colorado, and in my chapters on Denver and Pueblo, Colorado, I really am drawn to this person, Leonard Chuleta, who was the first Hispana principal of Denver Public Schools, and who was centrally involved in the work towards desegregation, bilingual education, and culturally responsive curriculum, in part by authoring a curriculum guide called the Rodeo, I'm sorry, it's blocked by my screen, but it's Rich Spanish Mexican Heritage. And so for her and in Denver, the work of the charros, she was a charro or a charra, and this really influential local principal, and again, drew on the charro as a source of empowerment for Spanish-speaking children. I also look at the ways that charreria or Mexican rodeo could be used to help ethnic Mexicans claim public space as they were suburbanizing in Los Angeles and to a lesser extent, suburbs of other Southwestern cities. And here, my hope was to show how suburbanization and residential integration is not only about private space, but about struggles for public space and the expression of a cultural identity as a way, again, of transforming racialized structures. And I finished the book by looking at the ways that charros have been caught up in animal welfare legislation. Several of the events in the Mexican rodeo have been deeply contested and controversial, and they've been subject to a lot of critique by animal rights activists, which has forced them into the legislative sphere. And so my last chapter looks at the ways that those debates about animal welfare have really led charros to scale up away from the local level and become national political actors, regional and national political actors, in a way that they've become formal political subjects. I'm gonna just close by saying something about how I came to this project, and I'll stop my screen share for a second. So I came to this project because I grew up in the suburbs of Los Angeles in the 1980s and 1990s. And this was a time, as Dan has written about in his first book, Racial Propositions, that was deeply, deeply contentious around issues of race and immigration. The way that I experienced those was that I grew up in a protected rural neighborhood in the city of Los Angeles, where horsekeeping was protected, where the rights to keep chickens and other farm animals was protected by city government. And it was also a neighborhood that was something like 90% white at a time when the city of LA was becoming majority Latinx and like less than 30% white at the county level. And so I became very interested in the relationships between the city's protection of rural landscapes and the unbelievably disproportionate whiteness of that neighborhood. And so I wrote about that in my first book, Making the San Fernando Valley. But it was also clear, even in those moments, that that was never the whole story. And in fact, for this book, I was really drawing on my own experiences as a child growing up, riding around my neighborhood and meeting out in public space charros who were riding their horses pridefully, with dignity, with skill. And I also, so I was able to see that in public space in my neighborhood, my majority white neighborhood. These were folks from adjacent neighborhoods. But also I was able to see how threatened local white folks in my neighborhood were by those alternative histories of horsemanship and skill. And so this book was really about trying to untangle those relationships and those tensions. And I'll just say, as a way of wrapping up, it has been amazing to me to realize that I have spent the last 15 years of my life and at least 2 books and some articles basically trying to figure out the tensions and the contradictions of my childhood. And I think that's one of the things that ethnic studies scholarship and scholarship in general can allow us to do. So thank you very much. I'll pass it over to Dan. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. I so appreciate, like, in your work, just how rigorous the balance is between like history and place-based, and it moves across all these sites, and how you've just narrated its connection to your own experiences. So, just again, thanks to Steve and RITM and folks who are listening today. And I'll just say, you know, in terms of like methodology for especially students listening, if you're looking for good models and examples, please follow Laura and Ana, because the only methodology that I can share here is kind of looking at things politically that have taken place in the last 10 years that relate to the kind of bottom dropping out, it seems, of our social life and economy and fabric, and the ways they've intersected with these kind of unusual developments connected to racial politics. So I just thought to try to share some of like how that worked for us. I would just share some of these images and kind of talk about what for us were always just questions on top of questions on top of questions. So this is the book, Producers, Parasites, and Patriots. And before I was at Yale, I was at the University of Oregon for 10 years. So that's really where this took root in 2012, right after the midterm elections. My co-author, Joe Lowndes, and I trying to figure out some of these developments. And I'll just start with this, since this group, the Proud Boys, was mentioned for those that might have watched the presidential debates last night. So a group that was started in 2016 by Gavin McInnes, a co-founder of Vice magazine and media, which kind of represented itself as what they called was a Western chauvinist organization. So they certainly would disavow that they were white supremacists as such, and yet constantly involved in not just kind of like street level violence and fight, but actually they became the kind of like street force of Trumpism in the aftermath of the election. And you'll see here, these are photos from different Proud Boys gatherings. And you know, what's startling here is the three-fingered OK symbol, which is now generally taken up to be a symbol of white supremacy, offered up by not just you know, a man of color who seemed to like wandered into the photo, but men of color who seem much more central to this project. And so part of what we know is this is not all of the book, but you know, part of the book was thinking about what we call the kind of multiracial or multicultural far right that has emerged since 2016, that goes hand in hand with the most white supremacist tendencies of the Trump administration and of conservatism today. And yet we, you know, from our perspective, didn't have good accounts to think about kind of how this was happening or where this came from. So in the lower left corner, this is a photo of the Proud Boys in New York City. You'll see a photo on the right, or an image of not only just all these men of color, but actually like self-described Guatemalan skinheads, immigrant skinheads engaged in immigrant bashing in New York City. So again, a lot for us to get our heads around, and I'll talk a little bit more about where we ended up, but these are some of what we kind of took up. I would say for, you know, during the book, we didn't conduct too many interviews, but, you know, really the most kind of vexing moment was when we talked to this figure in the middle, Joey Gibson, who at the time was running for, he was a kind of outsider candidate for a Republican Senate seat in Washington, and had just founded a group called Patriot Prayer, which has been very, very active in these kind of street brawls in Portland. And we asked him, like, well, where do your politics come from? Like, who's influenced you? And Gibson went on this long and very serious and sincere account of Dr. King, of the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins and their capacity to withstand state violence and their willingness to challenge it. He talked about the tragedy of the war on drugs and again, how the state has reached in and disrupted the lives of so many Black families and communities. He had a critique of Big Pharma. And so this was a strange, you know, we left the interview like, is this just kind of mouthing these, you know, if you were a progressive and a self-identified kind of anti-racist, these would be predictable kind of significations. But for Gibson, he was really in this active process of thinking about how certain traditions of the civil rights movement might be incorporated into what was a very grassroots far-right project. So these are some of the topics we take up in the book, especially in the latter chapters about the kind of multiculturalism of the far right. We write about this figure on the right, Sonny Johnson, who is a close confidant of Andrew Breitbart of Breitbart Media, very close to Steve Bannon, a movement builder within very conservative circles, has her own weekly radio show on Breitbart Radio that one can listen to if you have Sirius satellite radio that I highly, highly recommend. She's really an anti-racist figure on the right who has a vision of that the far right might be cleansed of the kind of racial antagonisms that it's been associated with in the last 40 years in particular, and that essentially Black communities could be the heart of a new pro-business, militarized, kind of anti-choice, anti-feminist right-wing project in which Black people would be the exemplars of those commitments. But there are just some other examples, images. So that, you know, these groups would often like go to kind of typical liberal settings, in this case, Evergreen State University. And you can see, you know, these openly Islamophobic and violent, it says United States ISIS hunting permit. And then this kind of provocation. Yeah, we're a racist group that accepts members of all races. But in fact, that's precisely what they are. They are a racist group on the far right that is multiracial in some ways. And it reminds us, it's not like the critique is not just, well, if the Klan had a diversity initiative and were more inclusive, then they would be, you know, kind of like politically in like there. It's also the substance of what they talk about, and that they're dynamic in this way. This is Enrique Dario, Afro-Cuban based in Miami, who's the head, the nominal head of the Proud Boys now. This is a picture with him and Roger Stones, again, showing a white power sign. So how are these sutures and these connections being made in kind of real time? Just a couple more images. This is Diamond and Silk, who often have appeared on the campaign trail with Trump, helping shore up his kind of nativist commitment, suggesting, and this is certainly has no correspondence to actual political behavior, but this argument that, you know, they have this line, Clinton could do mass incarceration, we can do mass deportation. So very kind of tricky, again, kind of suturings that are happening. And, you know, again, another like, whoa, what is going on? This is Paul Nealon, who ran for a GOP seat in Wisconsin, and he was a pretty unapologetic white supremacist. He was like, you know, they discovered these connections he had, and he kind of admitted them. He had Diamond and Silk do a commercial for him, which, you know, he used to try to talk about protecting American jobs. His rabid all-white base loved the appearance of Diamond and Silk, partly, you know, because it deflected perhaps charges of their own racial animus, but much more because from their perspective, they really animated this vision of a US nationalist, militarized, nativist formation that could be multiracial in that way. And I want to say, this is not targeted in any way towards Black voters. This is for white voters on the far right. This is Steve Bannon, who we found actually was continually making these appeals and addresses to Black businessmen and conservatives, in particular about how once the kind of era of globalism and US support for neoliberalism ended, hundreds of billions of dollars could be invested into Black communities, and the traction he got in that claim. And that while we're more familiar, you know, people have seen Kanye or Candace Owens, who's actually a much different kind of figure, there is a small but potent bench of Black and Latinx conservatives in particular, who really have a vision for how a new Republican Party might be built in the wake of this, and who are as far to the right as Trump. This is Senator Tim Scott, beloved by white Tea Party members in South Carolina, far more than someone like Lindsey Graham. Mia Love, a Republican congresswoman for 4 years. This is her speaking at a gun rights rally in Salt Lake City. You can see Confederate flags and militia flags there. You know, I just want to share this image. It's a little distorted, but this is from a web graphic. It says, which is the party of responsibility? Republican. It shows Love, by age 30, married, 2 kids, Saratoga Spring Council. This is Sandra Fluke, who the Democrats had asked to testify around access to birth control. And so in this vision, Love is the producer, the good, proper patriotic subject, and Fluke is the irresponsible kind of feminist subject who needs discipline. So these are just configurations we would not have expected. I'll just end here. This is Kay Coles James. She's now president, a Black woman, of the Heritage Foundation, really the conservative kind of like compass on the right. It continues to be as conservative as you would imagine, all white as you can see in this photo, but led by a long time kind of conservative movement builder. So I'll just wrap up to say, because I felt like I wanted to say something by way of like implications here, that the incorporation of people of color on the right actually and paradoxically makes white supremacy more durable. It shores up and legitimates its core features of militarism, patriarchy, nationalism, and hierarchy, the inevitability of hierarchy. These incorporations are really quite central, surprisingly, to Trumpism, and they can exist with Trump's more open white nationalist appeals, and they are not collapsing under under the weight of their own contradictions. And as we think, regardless of what happens in the election, all the kinds of reconstructions and things that will happen, this is something that's not going away. And I'll just end, because we do talk about a lot of the grassroots organizing that's happening on the other side to reimagine and rebuild social relations that could contest this, particularly in rural areas, this wonderful group, the Rural Organizing Project. Okay, so that's just a snapshot, and as chaotic and frenzied as I sound, that's partly our methodology in the book. And Ana, I'm gonna turn it over to you so they can hear about a proper academic project.
I don't know about the proper academic project, but it's been wonderful to hear both Laura and Dan's work. Oftentimes, even though we share meetings and all of that, we have very little time to really share our respective academic projects. So this is really a treat. So my book is really almost like an outlier in terms of my broader work that I've done throughout my academic life. And most of the time, and in most of the other work, I focused on working class Latinx communities in Chicago and in Newark. And that has been really the center of the work that I started doing as part of my graduate dissertation, my doctoral dissertation, and all the way until about 2012, when I decided to explore the other side of inequality and started to try to understand not only how inequality damages the possibilities of some, but also how it actually benefits others. And to do that, I decided to do an ethnography that involved participant observation, interviews, and lots of different methodologies, including some archival work. And it is a comparative ethnography of two neighborhoods, two elite, wealthy, mostly white neighborhoods. One of them is Ipanema in Rio de Janeiro, and the other one is El Condado in Puerto Rico. I spent about a month in each place, and my friends were really joking with me about it. They were like, "Oh wow, you went from walking the streets of Newark to like really hanging out at the beaches of the Caribbean and the Atlantic coast of South America." And the truth was that a lot of times anthropologists and ethnographers are associated with deep hanging out, what we call deep hanging out. So part of the research that you do really involves trying to not only interview people, but see if what they do in practice actually supports what they tell you that they do, right? So that's part of why we spend so much time with people. One of the things that I wanted to, the reason why I chose, there were several reasons why I chose these two specific sites, but what I found interesting, since we're talking about the actual, the background of bookmaking, is that I got quite a bit of pushback for assuming Puerto Rico to be part of the Latin American and Caribbean geography rather than being part of the US. There was a very strong push for me to turn this book into a US-Brazil comparison, even if I did it through Puerto Rico. And I had to really push back against that. And I felt very strongly that I just wanted to remove Puerto Rico from this side of exceptionalism, where it's neither covered by American studies oftentimes or by Latin American studies, because both of them feel that it doesn't fit quite into either one. So mostly I did my work among very wealthy parents. And the reason why I chose parenting was because I really wanted to study not people's necessarily income or economic wealth in a traditional Marxist sense, but also in terms of how they made the decisions around money and around resources moral. How do they explain that they have so much more than others? It was a really challenging project because I really, all the time, I was trying not to judge, which is part of what we tried to, in anthropology, we try to sort of step back and let people be who they are and sort of analyze what we get there, although that's always not always possible. So so one of the things that I did that I found out was also a contradiction. Like when Dan was talking, it made me realize that it was really a deep contradiction. I mean, here we have very wealthy parents who are very anti-consumption. They really don't want their kids to have everything. They're very selective in terms of what they give to children. So they're actually not the people that you would think they are. They're not, I think I went in there expecting, all this very pompous and people just wearing all these brand names and all these other things. And in reality, they were not at all. They were the kind of people that were very invested in what I call inner world cultivation, which means that they develop their whiteness as an interiority project. And so whiteness for them is not necessarily about displaying certain fashion or certain body practices, but also about being able to express who they are as people. And so so there were several things that were difficult to put up. I mean, to like sort of exert in terms of the actual project of writing the book and turning this project into a book. I think one of the main ones that happened very later on in the process was even the choice of the cover. So the cover was a back and forth fight with whoever decides on covers at the press. And by the way, I worked with these Latinx editors, 2 of them. I was like so blessed with that. I was just like, really, they were exceptional. But you know, when you're dealing with the presses, there are a lot of different departments. And I remember the insistence that I put a nanny and a child in the cover. And for me, I really wanted this to be about the wealthy parents, because a lot of times what happens in anthropological work is that we protect you know, we protect the wealthy and very much analyze the poor and working classes. So what I wanted was to make sure that they understood this is not a project about the nannies. This is actually a project about the wealthy people. And I just want the wealthy people in the cover. And of course, I turned out to be that diva, because everybody, you know, like thinks then like, oh my God, she's just like, hey, whatever. But anyway, so in the end, that worked out. And, you know, that was one of the things that I kind of really much insisted on. I think one of the main issues with a project like this, which is ethnographic, is that you bring your biography with you. And of course, that's true in every project to some degree or another. And in this particular case, it was really a tough project to be part of. Not for the reason, you know, like it was tough because obviously the entrance piece of like trying to get in touch with people that are this wealthy. The wealthy are very protected. So how do you get in touch with them? Once that is obtained, once that happens, one of the things that becomes really difficult is to try to learn to be at ease with this particular crowd that you are working with, and you know, that are your interlocutors. And so those are parts of the project that I work through out. Of course, you know, I was very aware of where the nodules of privilege were in the El Condado side, since I grew up in Puerto Rico, and I grew up not in any of those circles, but I knew of them. Like, you know, everybody was kind of knew where the good schools were and where the country clubs were and all of that. And then in Brazil, the challenges actually were different, because I was very accepted as somebody who was not from there. So everybody wanted to show me their lives. But at the same time, it was also this kind of consistently trying to understand people for who they were in the context that they were, you know, what they were showing me, and at the same time develop an analytical take on them, on the project. So I see both of a lot of people have asked me, you know, why Brazil is such a big country, Puerto Rico is such a small, you know, like all these other things. And I explain in the book, I spend quite some time explaining why I feel that these units, the neighborhood units, are comparable. I don't know how to share my PowerPoint, but let me see if I can just, oh, okay, actually, that's very, yeah. So I'm not gonna share very much, very many of these slides. I just wanna show the cover that I chose, but I also want to show the similarities of the 2 neighborhoods that I focus on. So on the left, there is, I wish I could point, but so on the left is El Condado. As you can see, there is a lagoon where a lot of the wealthy people spend their time kayaking, doing water sports, all of that. At the other side is the Atlantic Ocean and the beach. And that also creates its own luxury culture that was very, very much present among these elites and in their parenting. The same in Ipanema on the right. If you look at both places from the top, there's quite a bit of similarities in the landscapes of each. And one of the things that I center on is how does this geography, this particular geography that has become associated with wellness and healthy living and fitness and all these other things enters the world of parenting. One thing also that I wanted to examine through the lens of parenting was the bigger question of sovereignty and also of the language of corruption. And so, that became very evident once I was talking to people. At this point, both in Brazil and Puerto Rico, there were some, the countries were in a severe economic crisis. Most people talked about the government in terms of corruption. And all of the language became intertwined with how people view their way of raising children. And of course, when you put children in the picture, anything becomes justified. And that's part of why talking about your children is particularly powerful, because, nobody will criticize these wealthy people for wanting to protect their children. So I think that's all that I want to share. Let me see. I don't know how I get out of the sharing. I just do this. Oh, no. Sorry about that. So I'm looking forward to hear your questions.
Thank you, Ana, and thank you, Dan, and thank you, Laura, for these presentations. I'm going to remind our audience members, if you have a question, to please put them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. Ana, you shared with us a bit of the geography of Ipanema and of El Condado, and I wanted to take that question in a sense to Laura, who of course is a geographer, and her book, as she mentioned briefly, covers a lot of territory, and it thinks comparatively about charros and their practices in a number of different places: California, Texas, Colorado, as you mentioned, but also Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nevada, and perhaps elsewhere. So Laura, maybe you could talk a little bit about how your book uses a comparative geographical approach, and what the challenges of that approach were for you, and the importance of that approach were in the writing of this book.
Thank you. Yeah, I should say that when I first started this book, I had no idea where it was going to go geographically. I had one story I had stumbled upon in the archives about a group of suburban charros in Los Angeles in the 1970s, but I didn't know how that was going to become a book. It was clear that that story alone was not the book. As I started to share the project and just the general interest in charros with friends, with colleagues, with family members, they started to send me newspaper articles or things that they had found in the archives. And that led me to places like San Antonio that I really had very little knowledge about, and then sent me to Denver, and I started just stumbling across these things. And it became very clear to me that the charros in these various places were not the same. They were not the same kind of people in terms of class status. In some places they were working class, in some places they were middle class, in some places they were mostly immigrants, in other places their families had been in the US, like in New Mexico, since the 1700s. And so I at first was really quite overwhelmed by trying to make sense of this, how this figure had been used in so many different ways by such different groups of people. I started to wonder how those differences that I was observing might relate to the specific geographies of ethnic Mexican people in different parts of the US. And I eventually came to the conclusion that whatever charreria and the activism of charros looked like in different places was in almost all cases related to the specific processes through which ethnic Mexicans had been subjugated in those places. So in San Antonio, it made sense to me, or it later made sense to me, that the focus was on the economy because of the violence of the economy in South Texas, and the fact that ethnic Mexican people had been so confined to farm labor, for example. And so, whereas in Denver, it took the form of education for a variety of reasons. And so for me, that became the project, was to try to explain how and why the activism around the charro looked so different as a way to map out the different trajectories of ethnic Mexican people in various places across the United States. And I think this is something that we see a little bit in Latinx studies for other figures like the bracero or the pachuco, you know, but that I would like to see more of, because we know, for example, Lalo Licon, who's at University of Wisconsin, did a little bit of work, for example, on pachucos in Tucson and how that was different in Los Angeles. I think this is something that's really important to think about when we're studying any racialized community. The challenge of this was that I did not have lived experience in most of these places. The LA chapters were super easy to, well, a book chapter is never that easy to write, but they were much easier to write. The other places, sometimes I had never been to, or I had only been to for a few hours. And so what I did was I read deeply for graduate students on the webinar, or people who have been graduate students. It felt like I was doing an orals field for each of these places. You know, I spent a year reading about Colorado, ethnic Mexican people in Colorado. I tried to spend time in those places whenever I could. I spent one memorable day in Pueblo, Colorado, which was not enough. But it was really important to get to these places and to feel them, to feel what the land, and this sounds cheesy, but to feel what the land feels like there. And the spatial arrangements of things, and to try to understand how that might have affected the ways that folks were mobilizing in the past. And finally, I tried to talk to people who were from those places. You know, one day I took the train down from Yale's campus to Grand Central Station and met with Maria Montoya, a historian, Western historian who's now at NYU. And I was like, did I get it right? Did I get Colorado right? And I asked, you know, for her honest feedback on that. But I think that was the hardest part of it, was trying to learn about all these different places and their different histories of racialization and subjugation and dispossession, but also political activism, and to feel, you know, some degree of confidence in articulating those different histories.
Thanks, Laura. Dan, let me ask you a question that may be in part about your methodology, and it may also address a question that came in through the Q&A. You know, you worked on a collaborative project that was also a project that was unfolding in real time, and we of course saw this last night in the debate. These issues foregrounded centrally by the current president. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the methodology that you used with your co-author, and how you approached this project, studying things that really were unfolding around you, even as you were trying to make sense of them.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, for that question. I mean, just on the collaborative part, I was working on this at the same time as several edited volumes, and I'm back to writing something of my own now, and I just found collaborative writing to be so, it kind of just opened up so many possibilities, and I've just thought a little bit more about why. And part is there's just a built-in accountability when you're writing together to be constantly engaged with one another. There's something also about it, the way it treats writing as always an open-ended practice. So you can write something, share it, get feedback, add something. So the sense that everything you produce has to be finished and complete tends to diminish. And there's just an active way in which thinking and writing together when you're in conversation just really, for me, opened up a writing process. So we would often do this back and forth, because my co-author was in Oregon and I was in Connecticut, through text, through other, you know, short emails. But I realized that was part of the thinking, these very short efforts to try to offer a take. And it just speaks to the second question. I mean, we were trying to, at different points, write about the militia occupation that was happening in Eastern Oregon in late 2016, all of these some conflicts that were happening in Portland. So in that sense, these very kind of shorter exchanges in which we were trying to just get our heads around things really was a certain kind of writing methodology. And the last thing I'll just say about the chaos is, I mean, I so appreciate what Laura's saying about this effort to, you know, get things right, to feel like you're accurately representing, you're spending enough time where you're not just leaping to a conclusion. For us, I think we were relieved of some of that, because as things were happening, there were other people writing in much more comprehensive and longer term ways based on interviews. We wanted to try to think about certain kinds of like just takes, impressions that when we were putting things together. So for me, at least, I felt a little freed from some of that there would be other scholars really trying to offer the kind of definitive archival account of these episodes, and we could focus in some ways on the politics of them and their implications.
Great, thank you. Ana, let me turn to you. We have a question in the chat about publishing one's first book and then publishing a second book, and what you might say to yourself now, back then, when you were working on your first book, having since then had some experience with publishing. Could you talk about some of the similarities and differences between working on your first project and seeing it through to publication, and working on this project and seeing it through to publication?
Yes, that's a great question, and it makes me reflect on two moments of my life that were completely different. I mean, and I think that the book and the publication is very much informed by what predates that process, right? Like where you are in your life in that moment. My first book, which was in Puerto Rico and Chicago, the experience of doing fieldwork among the activists in Puerto Rico and Chicago simply changed my life and shaped who I became as a human being. That's not the same thing, and that is reflected in the kind of writing that I did. It was very difficult for me to remain critical of anything that I was looking at. I mean, it remained, I had like a stronger sense to please an audience. I felt that it was very tough to write that book from a very emotional perspective. And I didn't know how books worked. I mean, I was one of these people that I just like had no idea, like, what do I do? So I just started calling presses. It's like, oh, I'll just call University of Chicago. I'll call this other one. And it turned out that, I mean, one of those lucky moments, like I called the University of Chicago, and the secretary to the editor of anthropology and sociology at the time, David Brent, just picked up and he's like, oh, he's here. So I just pitched the thing in 2 sentences. He's like, oh, yeah, so I'm doing this. And he's like, yeah, send me the whole thing. So that freaked me out. It's like, oh my God, you're not going to ask for a proposal? Send me the whole thing. So the whole thing wasn't ready, obviously, because why would it, I'm just checking and calling. So I just tried to put it together and just send it. I feel that, and that was a wonderful first experience. I think that it's very rare that things happen that way now. This is back in 2000, I think, around there. And so for the last book, I felt my interest in the book was academic, and it was out of certain curiosity about having become a mother at the time and feeling completely overwhelmed, not by raising a child, but by the social pressures of other parents. So it became being in this hell of like New York City parenting. And I said, I need to get out of this hell. So let's get out of New York and the US as far as I'm in it. And secondly, I cannot just get out of the hell. I need to bring my child with me to the hell because I can't, have a child now. And so this became something that began in terms of trying to understand that reality and the pressure and the awfulness, like genuinely like becoming an awful person at moments because of this role that I was feeling, and understanding that this role is not about my own psychological existence. There is this very, very structural element to what parenting looks like, and trying to understand that. So by the time that I was coming up with the book, what really was in my head most is like how much these parents resemble my friends, myself and my friends oftentimes, right? And so is coming to terms with that contradiction of, I'm critical of these people, but we are all part of this and we are all sustaining this. How do we dismantle it? Because obviously all of this is doing is enhancing inequality, even if it's unintentional or whatever. And so for that, I also got very lucky with this, but I did have a book proposal ready just because I needed to organize my thoughts. Once you come back from field work, you have 20 million MP, like all these interviews to transcribe, field work, field notes. You have like tons and tons and tons of documents, and a way for me to get it together a little bit was to organize it in a book proposal format. And then I just reached out to Duke because I had liked some work that they had done, and I touched base with Gisela Fosado, this Chicana amazing editor, and it was a joy from then on. But yeah, but the two were very different, and I appreciate that question.
Thanks, Ana. So you've talked a little bit about the reception of your work by by editors, both at Chicago and at Duke. And Dan, I know you need to leave a little earlier than the other panelists, so I want to ask you a question about the reception of your work. You can take this in a direction that talks about how you worked with the press if you'd like to, but I actually wanted to ask you more generally about how you see the book doing work in the world since its publication, who you think has read it, if you've gotten any feedback from it, who you'd like to see read it, and what you'd like to see as the impact of the book.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, for that question. You know, for me, the most gratifying ways to connect to readers have been talks we've been able to give with some labor unions, community-based organizations, at other sites, which has involved what I think is the rich work of trying to figure out the relevance of the material and its insights to people's active organizing, understandings of the political landscape, et cetera. So those have been the most satisfying. I think that more challenging part, there's been two things. One is to write a book that feels like rigorous enough for our academic colleagues that draws on literature, relevant literature, while making it accessible to a wider audience. And I have to say that's difficult to do and something we struggled with and I still struggle with. The other part I think has been like how to not just turn these into, a lot of the interviews we did, they were kind of like, can you talk to us about these odd characters and offer some insight into their psychology, which was not the point of the book. And part of what I realized is that kind of taken out of context, that's part of what people can think that the work was about. So just kind of like funny people who like have lost their orientation. So I guess I'm saying that's for us been part of a balance between, you know, trying to remain faithful to some of what we hope is like the rigor in the book and the analysis and that it's pushing, while also having it feel like it's accessible in places and that it's been easiest when we're in the same room talking to people about it, listening from them, getting ideas from them. And that's also been the most satisfying part of it as well.
Great, thank you. Laura, let me ask you then a version of that same question. Just, you know, how you see your book working in the world, if it's had a life since it was published last year, if you have any sense about how it's been received since it was published.
I do. Thank you for asking. I think one of the things that I learned from my first book, to answer the previous question, that I didn't expect, but I was able to expect it this second time around, is that as authors, you know, we work on these things for many years and then we send them out in the world and there's a feeling that we are done. But in fact, that is the first time that the rest of the world is seeing it. And so that's actually in many ways like the beginning of the book's life. And that can be difficult, actually. Like I turned this book in and I was exhausted and did not want to think about it for a while. And then, you know, the press requests start rolling in. So, so that is something to think about for those of you who are publishing your first book, or really any book. For me, some of I think of a few things. One is that I was able to include photographs by a really incredible San Antonio-based photographer, Al Rendon. As he graciously gave me permission to use images on the cover of the book. And I have in the book this photographic interlude, mostly with photos taken by him, that tries to just explain what the different events are in the charreada. And for me, one of the things that was most gratifying when the book was published was to see him promote it on Facebook, because of how meaningful it was for him as a photographer who had spent like a decade of his life photographing these communities. And so I hadn't really intended that, but to see the ways that he, and then I later started to hear about so many people who learned about their families through these, learned about their communities, saw their communities in this book. And that was really gratifying. As one example, which is probably my favorite story to share about this, after I, maybe like 6 months ago, I got an email from a Chicana woman in San Diego who told me that she found my book on Amazon because she's not an academic. She found my book on Amazon because she was going to redecorate her living room in charro and ranch style decor, and was searching on Amazon for charros, and there popped up my book. And so that alone is amazing, right? That people might find our work when they're not looking for anything academic. But she bought it and she read it, and in the very first chapter, she saw her father. She read about her father and her uncle and some of her neighbors. And then she wrote to me and she was like, oh my gosh, you know, like, I can't believe it. And then she sent me photos that I, you know, and it was because I didn't do a lot of interviews and I didn't do ethnography for this book. It was just like to hear that the book could be useful, that it could connect with the people who I was trying to represent using other kinds of sources was super, it just made me glad I had done it, even though the book was challenging in so many ways. And then one last thing that I'll add is that I am now copied on virtually every email that Charros sends to their legislators. I'm in a long list of BCCs or CCs, and so I think that they see me as at least somebody who is following and tracking what they do, which I am. And it's just been super interesting. None of those things are things I would have predicted, and they go well beyond the academic circles that I was probably writing for primarily. Right.
Ana, I know you wrote your book, I think it's fair to say, primarily for academic audiences, but I wonder if you also had your own interlocutors in mind as potential readers, and if you could talk about how you see your book being read and what kinds of responses you've received thus far.
Yes, I'm thinking, when I was listening to Laura, I'm thinking of my first book, the Book of Puerto Rican Chicago, that became a study book for the very activists which were part of the book. So they would meet on book clubs. I mean, these were very a group that was very much aware of how history mattered in the present. And so that was, I think that was for me a very unusual. I mean, the fact that the very people who were on the book are reading, and of course they could tell who was what, and that caused all sorts of other things, even though I had tried to conceal a lot. This current book came out on the same day that we went on lockdown in New York. So all the different kinds of presentations, all the different kinds of things that I wanted to send books to some people that had been in the book, and all of that kind of got stopped. So the most that I've been able to tell in terms of impact, impact in academic settings, yes. I mean, I've gotten, mostly in terms of visits to pretty much, India, UK, just like a whole bunch of places, which surprised me. But those are academic settings. But in terms of how it's actually impacted, I think more of the people that were in the book, because this is an ethnographic book. So, you always wonder, and I know that the people in this book specifically will read the book. And one of them has already read the book, and she has been texting me about, wanting to learn more about her own white privilege, which is very interesting. I'm just like, wow. But, and I've told her, when I go to Puerto Rico, we can just get together and talk about this, because right now we're on WhatsApp, and that's like a lot of texting. But it was really interesting to hear her reflection on it, and like what she got out of it. At that point, she was halfway through, so I haven't heard from her since she finished. I don't know if I said anything like more objectionable in the last part of it. But I'm actually, and then another person from Brazil who works, who's always been very interested in just child experts and stuff like that, also wanted me to give a talk for one of her organizations. So there have been initiatives like that at this point, and all of that has been sort of colored by COVID. But it's always, like, especially for anthropology, for ethnography, it's just very interesting to see what the reaction is, not only for the broader academic population, but also for the people that feel that they're in the book. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Let me ask all three of you a final question, and you can take this in whatever way you want and tailor it to your own project. I mean, it strikes me that for each of you, the project that you're discussing was in some ways familiar to you in advance, whether it connected with personal interests and personal experiences, or in some way had relationships to past projects that you had done. But there are other ways in which each of your projects, represented something significantly new. And I'm thinking both for Dan and for Ana, working with populations, I think that you had not worked in quite this way academically before. So I'd love to hear all three of you talk a little bit about how you oriented yourself to this new material, how you thought about your responsibilities to representing the actors and protagonists and people you were discussing in this work, and what you felt to be the kind of key challenges that you'd like to share with other people in taking on a project that was in some ways new, and in which you may have been working with groups of people with whom you didn't share all ways of life and all ways of thinking. So, Dan, since again, I know you're going to need to take off a little earlier, maybe we could start with you and then go to Ana and then finish with Laura.
Sure. Great. Thanks, Steve, for that question. I mean, I think, you know, we spent a lot of time for this project. We were at militia rallies, you know, endless hours listening to right-wing radio on those sites. And I think what I felt like I was trying to do there was, you know, one, really understand the kind of like logic, the commitments, the worldview, listening for the openness to it. So it's not just that I already know the kind of narratives and positions that people hold and embrace. And certainly without then underestimating its violence, it's the potential harm that it had. You know, the day we interviewed Joey Gibson, the next day he was a part of a very vicious, you know, kind of brawl. So we were on the one hand trying to offer, you know, a nuanced account of the conversation we had with him while saying this is not meant to minimize everything he's done. And just the last thing I'll say is, you know, I'm doing a project now on this right-wing radio host, Sunny Johnson. There are long periods of time when I listen to her, when she's totally criticizing, lecturing white conservatives about their racism. And I strangely identify with her like anti-racist commitments that she's trying to enact, even though that anti-racism is in service of a far different vision. So I actually, and I don't seem to then say this like, see all the connections we can make, as much as just that these like ideas and possibilities are not somehow like just the sole possession of people who I connect with and identify with, that those ideas are out there in the world. They may have come from our communities and intellectual traditions, but many, many people are taking them up. And I think that has to be taken seriously. Otherwise, all you do is just dismiss it and say, you know, you shouldn't even be having this conversation. So that's partly what I've learned here.
Thank you.
Great. I mean, just listening to that, I can, you know, it reminds me of like all this conversations about cultural appropriation, and to what degree are these debates becoming this culturally appropriated, like possibly appropriated phenomenon. So I think that's, even though, yes, these populations were different from what the kind of work that I've done before, I've always really been interested in how psychology operates in a sociological way. I mean, like how therapy, psychology, affect, even acquire a material life. And I think that that continues into this project. In that sense, is not super different from that other kind of project. What was different and was very helpful is to understand how Latinx studies and Latin American studies need to be examined in junction. They need to be examined together. I mean, there is so much wealth of materials on both sides that would benefit our reading of the other. So that actually led to the edited volume that Steve mentioned on like this handbook of Latinx studies that I'm doing with my colleague and friend Merida Rua. So one of the things that I felt that came out of that process of the book that hadn't come from previous work was the clarity of those connections and those points of convergence between the fields. So I would say that had been something that I will continue to think through and try to implement, not only in my research, but also in my teaching and the classes that I put together, because I am very interested in making sure that in classroom discussions, we have the grasp of a broader body of literature, even when the class is Latinx studies or Latin American studies, as it may be. So, yeah.
Great. For me, this question about how do we, I hear it partly as how do we study communities that we're not fully members of, and that was a complicated thing for me. That mostly came down to the methods that I chose for this book. So my first book, I had done deep hanging out of the kind that Ana is talking about. I wrote about the community that I grew up in. I went to 4 years of really difficult and painful homeowners association meetings. I was writing about white folks that I grew up with, mostly white women, and the way that they thought about land. And in that sense, that was a very personal book. So for the second book, though, I was writing about people who lived in nearby neighborhoods, but were men, were older men, were Mexican American or Mexican immigrant. And so I had to think really hard methodologically, how could I offer something useful? And it became clear to me pretty quickly that I could not and did not want to do ethnography. And that was hard for me for a little while to kind of wrap my head around because I had been so committed to ethnography in the first book. I think it was also important to say, you know, there were logistical things here that any of us has to think about. I moved to the East Coast. There are some rodeo and vaquero scenes here, but they're not charros, and it's not the place that I was trying to write about. So logistically, it became really difficult for me to imagine doing deep ethnography with the folks that I was writing about. But also there had been, and there still are, pretty active animal welfare campaigns directed at charros, and they are led by people who look like me, white women, middle-aged, who grew up with animals. And so it was actually difficult for me to gain access. And I worry that if I had chosen to do a different kind of method, that so much of the work would have been charros trying to convince me to be their ally and their advocate in animal welfare debates. And the two interactions that I did have that were interviews, longer interviews, both took that direction really quickly. And so I had to step back from that and figure out a different method that could still allow me to answer the questions that I was curious about, but also that could be useful to the scholarship. And so I really thought about a lot of this book was writing in service to and to try to be useful to my own mentors who were mostly in Chicano studies. And to try to do something that could be useful to them and to the field. And it also became about writing something useful for the communities that I was writing about, but that was not ethnographic. And again, that was where I was able to identify that there was no history of these communities in the United States. There were a few ethnographies, there was no history, and there was no comparative geography. And so I landed on that, and I feel okay about that. Even though it was such a different thing from my first project, it became necessary because of my own subjectivity, my own location, geographically, subject location in relationship to the folks I was writing about. And I think the larger lesson that taught me, which has become important as I've matured a bit as a scholar, is to really acknowledge and embrace the fact that we can use very different methods for different projects and that we can feel differently about our projects. The first book was very personal. The second book was less so. It was more professional. Or I pursued it for more sort of professional and political reasons. And that in our long lifespan, hopefully we get to work on more than one project, but that there's room for all of that, and that we can do different kinds of work at different moments in our life, depending on how we're positioned and who we're in relationship with.
Well, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Ana, and thank you, Dan. I think that's a great place to close. I so appreciate the opportunity to hear from all three of you about how your books were made. And again, for our audience members, thank you for coming. You can see the titles of these books and some more information about them in the chat if you're interested. Laura Barraclough's book is Charros, How Mexican Cowboys Are Remapping Race and American Identity. Dan HoSang's book is Producers, Parasites, Patriots, Race, and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity. And Ana Ramos-Zayas' book is Parenting Empires, Class, Whiteness, and the Moral Economy of Privilege in Latin America. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciated hearing about the contents of the book, but perhaps more importantly, how you envisioned these books and how you pursued these topics and how you carried them out and how they were ultimately made. So thank you so much for being with us today, panelists and attendees, and we hope to see you soon at an RITM event. Take care.